What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? She asked the question like it was a small, dangerous thing, careful with its edges. It hung in the air between her and the stable door, a breath of winter that smelled like hay and metal, and something older, a life that had been lived so loudly it left an echo. The morning pressed itself against the windows in thin, honest light. Frost had traced the wheel ruts outside into fragile, papery maps. Her boots made the first dull thud of the day on the wooden step, and the sound felt indecent, like speaking in a room where people were still asleep. She moved slowly because moving fast felt like stealing. Her hands kept busy with small rituals, buttoning the top button of a coat she hadn't worn in months, rubbing a knuckle against a seam until it warmed. The stable smelled of damp straw and tack oil, of horse, breath and old blankets. Wind braided through the rafters and left cold threads on the back of her neck. He, the man who had owned the horse, who had taught her how to hold a rasp without thinking, who had left his tools on the bench the way someone leaves their life behind, had once called the place truth and labor. The words were now a coat hanging in the closet, fitting but empty. She did not come to the stable to grieve. She told herself that on the walk up the drive. She told herself that when she stepped inside and the familiar thud of a hoof made her chest tighten. But grief has a gravity. It had already rearranged how she breathed. Before she could see him, she felt him. A weight shifting in the stall across from hers. A breath that was too close to be only air. The horse's presence announced itself in small, animal ways. A slow exhale, the soft click of hoof against pack, the way ears rotated like tiny radar dishes catching her scent and deciding whether it was friend or weather. She paused at the threshold, hands loose at her sides. The stable light made everything a fraction softer, everything a little more honest. The horse did not snort, did not prance. He stood with his head turned toward the door, nostrils flaring, one eye half hidden in the shadow. He wore his winter coat like a borrowed heavy sweater, shaggy at the flanks, where she remembered the man brushing him on autumn evenings until the metal card of the curry comb sang. She thought she knew horses. She had worked with them enough to know the small cadences, the way fear tightened muscles into a hard line, how trust came with the polite distance of an animal that remembers being hunted, how curiosity could be as loud as a song if you listened closely. Still, this one folded her into a new kind of quiet. He was not frantic. He was not closed off. He held himself like someone waiting to see if the world would choose to return. When she stepped into the stall, the air was warm and smelled of molasses and hay and a tiny sharpness of iron. The horse's breath steamed there, and she watched it without thinking of breath as anything but the most precise thing, the metronome of a living being. She talked to him because silence sounded like accusation. Her voice was low, threaded with a kind of softness that belonged to people who have learned how to speak to rooms that remember everything. "Morning?" she said, and the syllable made a small cloud. He flicked an ear, his muzzle angled toward her outstretched hand the way a question leans in when it's not sure of the answer. He sniffed the cuff of her glove, whiskers brushing skin, and in that touch she felt the press of an animal deciding whether to trust a stranger or claim a familiar. He smelled of hay and a faint grease from the man's old coat, a smell embedded so deeply in the horse she could have sworn the coat's memory was stitched into the mane. She did the small, ordinary things people do when they are trying to practice being alive. She extended her palm, let it rest on the warm, triangular bone beneath his neck, He did not startle away. He did not shove into her. He leaned into the hand as if it were a thing that might steady him. A horse's trust is never given lightly. It is bartered for inconsistency and patience, and the exchange settled between them was the most private kind of commerce. There was a scar along his jaw she had never seen before, a pale crescent, thin as a pencil. The man used to tell stories with his hands. He would have laughed and said the horse earned it on some wild ridge, saved his life from a barbed wire fence, had danced with a thunderstorm. But the mark on the horse's skin read like a question she could not answer alone. When she touched it, the hair was softer there, as if the world had decided to be gentler in a place that had once been rough. She walked the perimeter of the stall with the horse. At her side, he followed without being coaxed, a step behind and then a step ahead, attentive in the way of animals that notice the smallest change in a human's breath. His eye tracked her hands when she lifted the feed bucket. He watched the small, deliberate ritual of filling and setting down. When his teeth found the hay, it was with the ineffable slowness of things that have been practiced into perfection. Not greed, but the focused economy of an animal that eats to stay alive and live another day. He had a habit of dragging the tip of his lip along the edge of the manger, a small, impatient baring of the teeth that was almost a grin and almost a complaint. Once, in the middle of a long winter, she had watched him stand unmoving for an hour, ears forward, listening to a sound outside no one else noticed. Later, the man had said it was the sound of foxes arguing, a tiny war no human could hear unless another life chose to point it out. She found herself explaining nothing and everything: the weather, the calendar, the way the day felt like something that could break if handled wrong. Her voice filled the space with trivialities because they were easier than sentences about loss. The horse listened like someone who had been alive long enough to know grief is a wide river that runs under so many moments, and animals know how to stand on the bank without asking to cross. When she needed to measure her heart, she put a hand against the horse's shoulder and felt the slow drums of life. The beat was steady. It was not miraculous. It was simply, insistently, alive. In that rhythm, she found an arithmetic that greed or rage or regret could not upend. She gave him a name without asking. Names are how people try to anchor themselves. To gentler things, it felt improper and necessary at once. The name tasted like the start of a sentence she wasn't ready to finish. There were little things that belonged to the man scattered in the corners of the stable: a leather rasp with the edges dulled by habit, a pair of gloves with the fingertips worn thin, a mug with a chipped rim. Each object hummed with a presence she could not quite invite in. Sometimes she would pick one up and bring it to the horse, feeling foolish as though she were trying to bridge a funeral with small domestic acts. The horse accepted the objects in his quiet, circular way. He would sniff them, turn them with his nose, decide their purpose, or dismiss them. He was a judge whose verdict arrived without words. On the third morning, as the sun drove a pale spear through the stable door and set dust to flight, she reached for her coat and paused. Her hands remembered the pocket where a scrap of paper had lain, a note she had never read in full. The memory of it was like a music box half wound, an agreement held together by a thread. She felt, suddenly and entire, the absurd and fragile. Hope that perhaps, within the horse's small universe, there was a map to something she had lost. People talk about animals as mirrors. That day he felt less like a mirror and more like a locked drawer whose key had been misplaced. She did not know what he would show her when that drawer opened. She did not know if opening it would hurt or heal or both, in ways that made everything else rearrange. She turned to leave the stall for a moment. to fetch the gloves she always left beside the saddle, to let herself breathe outside where wind could rake her face and not pry at the wound she carried like an old coin. As she moved, his head lifted. He followed her steps with the attention of an animal that does not ask permission to care. She didn't know why she expected him to stand still, bound by routine. She didn't know why, when she glanced back over her shoulder, she felt that small, fierce prick of something like being seen. She didn't know what it meant that he matched her pace, stayed a careful shoulder's width behind, as if he had decided, irrevocably, without ceremony, to walk beside a person who had been learning to be quiet in a very loud world. She left the door ajar. The day outside smelled like frost and the beginning of change. When she reached for the path that led down to the lane, she looked over once more and found the horse watching her. The look in his eye was not human. It was not supposed to be. It was patient and present, and it contained a question she felt in her bones. She did not answer, but when she turned to leave, the horse followed. She had learned, foolish as it felt to admit, that grief arranges itself into a series of small tests. The first time you walk past his boots without picking them up. The first cup of coffee you make for no one. The first time you stand in a stable and pretend the air does not hold a person. The horse changed the nature of those tests. He made them less about endurance and more about answers. Days folded into a rhythm. She came at dawn when the world was brittle and blue, came at dusk when the light smeared itself into the corners of the stalls. They built a language out of small things, the tilt of a head, the way she set the halter on the bench, and he would nudge it with a soft curiosity that suggested he considered the halter as a kind of ritual rope between two lives. He learned the path between the feed bucket and the grooming rack. She learned the map of his body by touch, the hidden hollows where the muscles sloped like hills, the places he liked to be brushed until his skin warmed. There were strange, private ways he answered the shape of the man who was gone. Sometimes he would lift his nose and prick his ears at the same hour the man used to whistle while he worked. Once, when a tractor passed the lane, the horse watched the sound like someone waiting for a voice he recognized. Small things, but they gathered like breadcrumbs into a trail she could not ignore. She found the first clue by accident. It was a late afternoon when she stayed longer than usual, hands smelling of linseed and straw, coat collar turned up against a wind that had teeth. She was closing the tack trunk, because some habits demand completion, when her fingers brushed against a folded scrap wedged behind a stack of worn halters. The paper was the sort that keeps secrets, thin, yellowing, edges softened by thumbprints. Her name was written across it in the man's handwriting, the angle of the letters the same as the lines he once carved into fence posts when he turned a joke into proof. She ought to have left it there, an artifact of ordinary grief. Instead, she unfolded it like a map, and the ink smelled faintly of the workshop, the way old letters do, a place where hands worked and left a trace. The note was brief, a sentence tossed into the future like a stone into a pond. It read, simply, if she ever needs it, the shed behind the old apple tree. Key taped under the third stone from the left. Her chest narrowed. The shed had been a place of light and shadow, of broken promises and mended things. She had not thought of it as anything but a place for tools. And yet, here was a direct line. The man's handwriting had left an invitation, and the horse, who had been following the same invisible compass, began to behave like a patient accomplice to some gentle unveiling. She found the key because of the horse. On the morning she chose to go, he tossed his head at the orchard and pranced once in a way that seemed deliberate. Horses are storytellers when you listen. the tilt of a shoulder that tells you to look left, a sudden shiver that means they smell rain. He walked with her across the frost-stiff grass, and when she knelt to peer under the trio of stones, his warm flank rested against her shoulder. His breath fogged the air. It felt, absurdly and completely, like an oath. Inside the shed, there were things that made her laugh and then made the laughter fold into something else. A box of empty film canisters, a tin of screws, a photograph tucked in a mason jar lid, the man younger, laughing, arms slung over the horse's neck, son bleeding behind them. On the back, a scribbled note, "For when she forgets him by not," remembering he loved her even before she knew how to be loved back. The discovery loosened something the shape of a sob. She sat on the floorboards while the horse nosed the lid with careful gentleness, as if to confirm the photograph's truth. Her hands trembled when she lifted the paper. There were no instructions for how to read a life back into yourself, only these small human artifacts that insist you are part of something that once mattered. The breaking point arrived not as a thunderclap, but a quiet, inevitable spill. That evening, she stood in the yard and opened the photograph again, and the world contracted until the image hummed loud enough to drown out practicalities. She pressed the photo to her heart and felt the shape of the man in the hollow beneath, her ribs. The refusal to assemble herself around the evidence she had found was a gentle cruelty she had been administering for months. It felt like a choice between staying sad and turning toward life. The horse, sensing the collapse of the dam inside her, came and stood squarely in front of her, his head lowered until his forehead met her chest. There was no spectacle in the gesture. It was ordinary as breathing. He stayed there until she had emptied her pockets of the confessions held within them, a receipt, a leaf, a pebble the size of a thought. He did not flinch at tears. He did not hurry her healing. He only kept the rhythm of presence. Her grief did not end in that stall. No step is that tidy. But what happened was more accurate. The edge dulled. Where every day had once been a clean cut of pain, the line softened into a margin where other things could live. Weeks became a ledger of small recoveries. She started, leaving the radio low in the corner while she cleaned hooves. She began to take the long route home sometimes, and the horse walked beside her as if they were two people learning not to be alone together. There were other revelations, quieter and stranger. The horse led her, literally led her, to a narrow hollow under the apple tree one late summer afternoon. He pawed, then nosed, then pawed again, until she dug with her hands and found a box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a stack of letters the man had written but never sent, fragments of confessions he could not risk speaking aloud. Some were apologies, some were promises, some were ridiculous poems about crooked fences. One letter, folded like a patient. Bird began. For the day she stops shrinking her laugh. She read them by the side of the horse, sun stippling the pages, and the words stitched into her in ways that were more than explanation. They were a map back to a person who had been brave enough to make mistakes and small enough to laugh about them afterward. The horse had been the key, and the courier, and the truth, ordinary, messy, unglamorous, had turned out to be a kind of medicine. Months went by. People who do not live with animals underestimate the exactness of the company they offer. The horse learned to stand under saddles without fuss. She learned to braid manes with the same careful attention she used to arrange letters. The town noticed. Neighbors who had watched her like a story resumed their small generosity. Someone offered her work shoeing in the market. A child waved from a porch, and she waved back in a way that felt like a beginning. One afternoon, as the light leaned long and forgiving, the horse did something small and irrevocable. They were walking past the shed when he stopped, put his nose to the ground, and pawed gently. He lifted his head and looked at her in a way that had nothing to do with hunger or habit. He looked at her like an animal who had been present for the exact moment something shifted and wanted her to see the evidence with him. She knelt and felt the earth between her fingers. Loose there, beneath the topsoil, was a tin she had never seen before. Inside it lay a ring the man used to wear on days when he fixed a broken bit or mended a fence. The metal dulled, edges worn. It was not a jewel. It was a thing of work and weather. When she touched it, the weight in her chest rearranged into something that kept both sorrow and gratitude without letting either flatten the other. It occurred to her then, with the quiet conviction of a conclusion reached by elbow grease and patience, that the horse's gifts were not answers in the way people ask for answers. They were tending. He had been the steadying thing while she learned how to be alive with absence. He did not lead her to a tidy moral. He led her to the work of being soft with herself. Time shifted again. Smaller increments. Months settled into a year. She did not forget. She did not pretend. What changed was how she moved through mornings. There were mornings the grief sharpened, and mornings it softened, and the horse was there for both, a public and private witness to the life someone else had loved, and the life she was learning to love back. One cold dawn she walked the lane with him and felt the air as if it were a new lesson. She laughed quietly at something the horse did, the silly way he sneezed when he thought someone had cast him a joke. The sound surprised her. It rose from somewhere that had not been used in a long time. The laugh did not erase the past. It made room for it. As she tightened the strap on the saddle, she realized the closure the prompt had promised was not a single point. It was a series of small, honest acts stitched together by consistency and animal attention. He had been the farrier's playful pony in the old stories, reckless in ways that made work easier and joy possible. He had been a hand on her back that taught her to stand again. When they walked back across the yard, the horse walked with a certain assurance, as if he had delivered a package and was satisfied with the postage. She let the reins lie loose on his neck. The world did not unmake itself. The grief did not vanish. But she felt a lightness in the way one feels after a window has been opened in a room that had been shut for too long. Sometimes, she thought, as she watched him chew a piece of straw, the ones who carry us aren't always the people we expect. Sometimes they are heavy, hoofed things with a patient face and a steady breath. Sometimes they are the ordinary miracles that happen when someone leaves you a map and an animal decides to follow the lines. If this story touched you, subscribe, leave a comment, follow, and press the bell icon to watch daily videos and enjoy.